In the previous video, we learned about the Amazon Web Service Management Console. Now we'll look into AWS Lambda. In this video, we are going to take a look at the Lambda web dashboard, at Lambda function blueprints, how to configure and deploy your Lambda function, and how to test it, all from the Management Console. I'm currently signed into my Management Console. I'm still in the Frankfurt region. So let's head over to the Lambda service. This is my Lambda web dashboard. I don't have a Lambda function yet, so I click on the blue Get Started Now button to create my first function. Here you can select from a number of blueprints, which give you Lambda functions with a little bit of dummy code. You can filter by runtime, and since in Volume 1 we want to use Node.js, I click on the Node.js 4.3. Let's use the blank function blueprint. Optionally, I can create a trigger that triggers my Lambda function. There are different kinds of triggers, but for the first exercise, let's not select any trigger. Let's leave it empty and just click on the Next button. Now we need to enter some configuration information for our function, such as a function name. The runtime is correct, so we scroll down a little bit, and here you can see that I have a function handler, this function, which I assign to this property, which I then export through Node.js style export. My Lambda function handler takes up to 3 arguments. The last argument, the callback, is optional. The first argument is my event. So my Lambda function is triggered through an event. The caller of my Lambda function can pass in information. For example, if an S3 object created event invokes my Lambda function, I can retrieve object metadata. If an HTTP request invokes my Lambda function, I can retrieve, for example, a JSON body from the HTTP event. The second object is the context of my Lambda function, so the runtime, I can access runtime information through this context object. And last but not least, the optional callback function is a typical Node.js arrow first callback function. I can invoke it, in this case, without an arrow, so I set the first parameter or the first argument to null, and I set the result, the second argument, to hello from Lambda. So the caller will retrieve the message hello from Lambda when the Lambda function is invoked. Let's scroll down. What I also need to do is set the right permissions for my Lambda function. To do that, I click on the role drop-down and I create a custom role. I create this Lambda basic execution role and I click on Allow. So this sets my role to Lambda basic execution role. Let's go down further. Here I can configure the amount of memory that I want to use in my Lambda function. The more memory I give it, the faster it executes, but the more I also have to pay. Let's stick to the smallest amount, 128 megabytes. I can also specify a timeout, so if my Lambda function doesn't terminate within this timeout, or within this amount of time, then it times out. Let's leave it at the default of 3 seconds. Let's scroll down and click on the Next button. I can review my settings, scroll down and click on Create Function. Wow, I've created my first Lambda function. Let's test it. I click on the Test button up here. And this will execute my test. It says hello from Lambda. I can also configure my test event like this and give it sample event data. Since I don't use the event in my simple Lambda function at all, it doesn't matter what I paste here. So I simply click Save and Test. In the next video, we are going to use API Gateway Service to create an API and connect it to our Lambda function. Then we will invoke our Lambda function through the API. Stay tuned.